Okay, so this first part is over those major land biomes. I want you to understand how to define a biome. So biomes are defined by climate. Oh, let's use black initially, please.
Josie, run back, come to the office. Josie?
They're defined by climate, and they're defined by plant life. I don't really need to list all the different biomes and what they have in special about each one of them, what makes them unique, because you do that in your worksheets, and you can use your worksheets for that information. But I do want to clarify a few things just to make sure you kind of understand it. Right? Obviously, the plant life is pretty obvious because there's a pretty big difference between a grassland and a forest. Right? When you have all grasses versus all trees, it's a pretty big difference. The climate comes into play because you can have a tropical grassland. You can also have a temperate grassland. So the savanna is pretty hot year-round. That's a tropical grassland plant. Whereas where we live is temperate. So climate, it might have to do with temperature. Is it hot year-round? Is it seasonal? Cold in the winter, warm in the summer? Is it cold year-round? That can make a difference. But along with climate, it's not just temperature, it might also be precipitation, the amount of rainfall. Because there are temperate deciduous forests and there are temperate rainforests. And the only major difference is how much rain that falls during that year in that place. Right? So if there's lots of rain, it's called a rainforest. There's lots of precipitation. If there's little to no precipitation, then it's probably a desert. Right? So speaking of which, we know that each biome is classified based off of its climate, its plant life. What do you guys associate with deserts? Rock? Camels, sand?
Snakes.
What's a desert like other than that? Dry. It's dry. What else? So that's the one that a lot of people come up with. They think that a desert is going to be dry, which yeah, it is. But we also usually think that it's going to be hot. Now, at the end of the day, when you're actually defining biomes, you really don't want to think hot when you think desert, because the Arctic is technically a desert even though it's cold all year round. Deserts are defined by their precipitation first and foremost, and their lack of plant life, because it is just sand and rock, right? So don't think hot. That's just one of the major things that some people get confused every once in a while. A desert does not have to be hot. It can be really cold. So know that. Also, again, just to clarify, what land biome, what major land biome do we live in around here? Probably a grassland. What kind of grassland? Temperate, because we have a winter and a summer. Now that may or may not be true depending on where you live, because if you're north of Rushville, you might actually be in kind of a forested area, right? But generally speaking, around here in Nebraska, we live in a, weird. We live in that temperate grassland zone. So that might be useful information for you just to make sure you know that. Right? That was a question on a quiz or a test. The other thing that comes up in that section that just specifically we could go through, when you talk about polar ice caps and mountains, they can't really define those as a biome. It's really hard to do so, at least, because I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that, but when you're going up a mountain, things change a little bit, right? Ultimately, there's that tree line. So you might have started out with that boreal forest, and then you get to the top, and there's no trees at all, and then it's just completely different. So when you're trying to define some biome based off of climate and plant life, you kind of want things to be consistent. So a lot of times, these two things, polar ice caps and mountains, are really just kind of their own special case. They're not considered part of any particular biome because they're too hard to define to put them into one thing or another, just because things change. In a mountain, things change just based off of elevation alone. When you're down towards the bottom of the mountain, it might just be like a grassland, a plain, right? And then you get into a forested area, and then at the top, there's no trees again. So, and it might be snow-capped even. So it's kind of difficult to define those things. So we don't really call those biomes. So deserts are not hot. Not necessarily. They can be hot. We live in a temperate grassland, and polar ice caps, mountains, those are kind of hard to define, so we don't really call them biomes necessarily. We don't stick them, lump them in with any other biomes. So remember, temperature, precipitation, plant life, that's the major thing. So a tropical rainforest, you kind of have all three of those things in there, right? Warm year round, rains all the time, it's a forest, there's lots of trees. Okay, otherwise, flipping the page, when you got these freshwater, even marine ecosystems, any kind of water ecosystem, I just want kind of a little flow chart in here, just so that we can kind of see the pattern again. But again, this is basically that hydrologic cycle from a while ago that we did. So, one major thing, first off, just looking at these three things, marine is ocean. And so there's salt in that water, right? Salt water. Freshwater means that there's no salt on the other hand. And an estuary is actually where those things mix together. So it might be kind of salty, kind of not salty. Somewhere in between. Sometimes actually when you're in one of those places where they mix, you can actually see two distinct layers, two different levels of water, that one is salty, the other one's not. So they can form these haloclines, these little density different liquid, one liquid on top of the other. So understand just what those basic terms mean. This is, an estuary is where that fresh water pours out into the ocean and those things are mixing together. So it's like in a delta, like basically the entire state of Louisiana is an estuary to a certain extent. Otherwise, just some basics. So I'll go through this kind of flow chart here. You got watershed that might create a stream. Ice melting on the mountain starts to collect, forms that stream. That stream could feed a river. That river could eventually get out into the ocean. Remember, you have that estuary first, and then you're out in the ocean. So water can get from the top of the mountain, melt off, and end up in the ocean eventually. But you'll know there's other pathways as well, obviously, because those streams and those rivers might actually empty and fill a pond or a lake. You know that ultimately some of that water is going to sink down and fill that aquifer that's below us. You actually know that sometimes that water below ground can make its way back up and start a stream again. But there are just a few things up here that we kind of need to focus on specifically as far as those ecosystems are concerned. I do have one last thing here, I forgot that. That stream, that river can also empty out and kind of form wetlands. You know how Florida is kind of all wetlands, or at least a lot wetlands, where you just have standing water all over the place. It's not really a pond or a lake because it's not deep, but you have water covering a large area of land that's a wetland. So those are some different options as far as ecosystems are concerned, and I just want to point out a few specific things about some of them. First off, these two are pretty important, estuary and wetlands. And they're important because they have the biggest biodiversity out of all of those water ecosystems. They have more different kinds of living things than any other place. So in those wetlands, it's a huge biodiversity. In estuaries, there's a huge biodiversity, lots of different kinds of living things. So they are the most diverse. Whereas when we talked about the land biomes, where was the most diverse ecosystem? Which one had the most different kinds of living things in it? You could flip over a leaf and there'd be a million new bugs we've never seen.
Rainforest.
A rainforest. So if I go backwards one slide here, that's another thing that we could probably point out here. That rainforest is the most diverse of all those different land biomes. But wetlands and estuaries rival with the rainforest to a certain extent. They have a lot of different kinds of living things in them as well. Sometimes they'll call this estuary up here, so just some kind of different mark. The nursery of the sea, because a lot of different things that live out in the open ocean will come into an estuary to lay its eggs if it's a fish, or have its babies if it's a mammal, right? Like a whale might come into a bay to give birth because it's a good protected, sheltered area with lots and lots of food available, typically, right? There's a huge biodiversity again, so there's lots of nutrients, food and things like that available, so it's a good place to raise young animals that eventually would go out and live in the ocean, open ocean. Other than that, our other keys to look at here, right? Wetlands can also kind of sink down and fill that aquifer, but ultimately we know why that aquifer below us is pretty important. Why is it important? Why?
It's our fresh water source.
Because that's where we get our clean, good water. And places like New York that have built cities on top of wetlands that were originally there, they don't have those ecosystems that provide them with nice, clean, good fresh water. They have to pay a lot of money to get that. So the emphasis you put on that aquifer there again is that it gives us really good, clean water. Oops. Can't spell clean today, apparently. That's all right. So that's obviously something we could emphasize a little bit. Those aquifers are pretty important. They're filled by, to a certain extent, wetlands and or ponds and lakes. Right, as that water sinks down, right, it gets filtered as it's going through the ground. And that's how we get most of our clean water. At least most places do. Some places have to pay a lot of money to get their clean water. Okay, so that's all we really need to cover for those two things. You can go back to working on your worksheets.